Hello, and welcome to another episode of my Singularity Let's Play. This is Northstar. I hope you folks are well. This is just going to be a quick video proceeding a bit through the fungus exploration, then I'm going to try and get to a video or two or three, because it might take a few attempts to succeed in the maps I want to do. Rebel Inc. Also, right up until my energy collapses, because for those of you new to my series, I'm disabled long COVID. My energy is quite fragile and will often just completely collapse. And I can also get post-exertional malaise if I try and push through that. It leaves me too sick to work. Obviously, disabled. I mean, not all disabilities leave you too sick to work, so I guess it needs to be said, but our government isn't. I'm an American, and the U.S. government is not doing shit to invest in a cure. In fact, Trump is cutting the research budget, the medical research budget in the United States, causing even diseases that are right on the verge of being cured to be basically abandoned. So, yeah, this sucks, and it's not surprising with the country descending into fascism, fascism is the result of the ruling class when capitalism hits crises, so that they can retain their power, lest the masses start considering eating the rich, so to speak. I mean, there hasn't been that much demand yet to tax the rich more and provide a better standard of living for everyone, but there's starting to be, calls for that, and that's enough for billionaires to get ahead of the game and push things towards fascism. Plus, I mean, at this point, they're not even just trying to prevent things getting worse for them and better for everyone else. They're trying to make things worse for everyone else and better for them by giving themselves massive tax cuts, funded by cuts to programs that benefit ordinary people. Of course, the thing that doesn't get cut, of course, the thing that doesn't cut is the military budget, because that actually makes billionaires richer. It's not good for the economy. The idea that war is good for the economy is a lie. It's broken windows fallacy. Partway the idea that replacing things destroyed in war is somehow good is nonsense. But also broken window fallacy more broadly, in that effort is being uselessly spent on something that doesn't benefit ordinary people in any way, making weapons, instead of money being spent on things like infrastructure. So, don't get me wrong, government deficit spending on the military generates jobs, but government deficit spending on infrastructure also generates jobs, and often more jobs for the same amount of spending. And on top of that, the debt that's ran up with deficit spending hurts future job growth. So the number of jobs will be increased in the near term by the deficit spending by borrowing from future growth. So, at some theoretical time point, I don't know, 100 years down the line or 40 years even down the line, there's fewer jobs than there would have been if there had never been the deficit spending. That's just broadly. But then if the deficit spending is sent on something that will create long-term economic benefits, like infrastructure, that can actually partially weigh that out or even completely cancel it and cause there to be more jobs than without the infrastructure spending. So, military spending is a direct alternative to deficit spending on infrastructure, so it is harmful, hurts the economy, does not help it. It may be beneficial for the economy versus the government cutting taxes and spending almost nothing on anything. Perhaps in that having insufficiently active government can be bad for the economy, but if the government gets involved in, building roads, highways, ports, upgrading power lines, those kind of things, generates more jobs. And not only that, but there's things like investing in scientific research, which should not be left up to the private sector. Um, there are a lot of things that are not going to be invested in the private sector because it takes a long time for the research to pay for itself, even if it pays for itself massively. And there's a good chance the company invested in the research will have been bought up in a merger acquisition or have gone bankrupt or something, not even exist by the time the research pays off. These aren't things with a low return on investment and takes a long time because of that. No, we're talking about things that have a delayed return. So for 20, 30 years, nothing, and then a massive return then. Private industry will never invest in that kind of stuff. Government should. Like curing diseases. A lot of times you have to do a lot of basic legwork with absolutely no economic returns for 20 years, and then you figure out how to cure a disease, which has massive economic returns. But you have to do the basic research first. And industry does not invest in basic research. So even if you adhere to capitalism, and you shouldn't, because capitalism is a terrible, fucked up system that will destroy itself, Marxists have correctly looked at theories, correctly done economic analysis and figured out stuff like declining rate of profit. The problem is there's some flaws in Marxist theory. Couple different things. On the political side, Lenin's ideas became dominant within Marxism and i.e. Marxist-Leninism. Not all Marxists are Marxist-Leninists. I am not. I am a democratic socialist, a Marxist, but not a Leninist. Because the key, well, Lenin was right on a great number of things. He was very, very, very wrong about one important thing that ended up dooming the Soviet Union, and that's democratic centralism. The idea that all the working class parties should merge into one giant party. That leads to one party state. A one party state is not very functional. The Soviet Union's politics were a fruit basket. Fruit basket? Yes, that's the right term. My long COVID, sometimes I'm like, am I using the right term for like saying? Sometimes I forget things I used to know, even really obvious things like words for things or phrases. Their economy actually showed good long-term GDP growth rates. Long-term, mind you. People will average the yearly growth rates like, oh, it wasn't that impressive. That's because their economic growth is steady. They didn't have the boom-bust cycle that capitalist countries have. So if you have a boom-bust cycle, you can have really strong economic growth one year, and then you can lose all the growth you gain that year the next year. And it'll actually average. I'll give you an example. I always give this really obvious. Easy for people to understand. The economy doubles in size one year and then loses half its value next year. So plus 100% GDP growth, minus 50%. This is an extreme example, but the annual average growth rate will be plus 25%. But in the 2-year average growth rate, which is not even long-term, usually when you talk about long-term averages, you're talking 5 or 10 year, looking at how much has the economy grown from the beginning of a period to 5 years later? What's the change? But even that 2-year rate will be 0% growth. Yet the annual rate, 1-year rate, is plus 25. Annual rates are misleading. And when you look at long-term GDP growth rates, the Soviet Union far exceeded the United States, exceeded most countries in the world. However, most of that economic growth, and it gets a little tricky. People argue, how can you really measure the economy of a socialist nation? Well, for one, they actually still had a lot of market mechanisms. Not everything was by non-monetary means. But for two, the Soviets kept meticulous records, and their records on things like production fairly accurate, except for the period where Stalin was really paranoid about economic sabotage in the 30s, and then you see some falsified production reports. But actually, most of the records are fairly accurate. But not all, and there are periods where it can be inaccurate, but people fudge numbers in the US about the economy too, so that's actually not that unique, that there's some fudging here and there. But anyways, most of the growth was in heavy industry, so cement production, steel production, timber, metals of various sorts other than steel, stuff like copper, tin, titanium. And this heavy industry was beneficial to the military. It was beneficial to the construction of a lot of housing. The so-called commie blocks were not up to standards the Soviet Union wanted to build housing for the masses, but they had actually the fastest rate of urbanization the world had ever seen, because you had all these people moving out of the countryside into cities where there were all these factories being set up, because the Socialist Communist Soviet Union was very, very good at constructing a lot of factories very quickly. Um, Ended up starting to choke their growth, uh, or a few things. Um, One, the Soviet Union ended up with a labor shortage, and because they were isolated by the capitalist world, the U.S. was keeping them under sanction, diplomatically isolated. They couldn't really draw a lot of immigrants. There was also a lot of propaganda against the Soviet Union, so people outside the USSR and its allies did not have an accurate idea of what life was like, and they were unlikely to move there as immigrants. There was also, unfortunately, still some xenophobia within the Soviet Union, so politicians weren't as open to immigration as they should have been. That's the first thing. A labor shortage developed, which, if there's no one to work new jobs, then you can't build new factories because there's no one to fill them. This actually led to the managers of factories often hoarding labor, working to knowing they're going to have future growth and the need for employment. They would hire people that they didn't really need and hold on to them until they needed them, and that hurt economic growth. The second thing was the way that they accounted for labor productivity. They still effectively used a system that was basically based on how capitalists do their accounting, that was actually deeply problematic for the Soviet Union. Instead of having expenses, revenue, and then profit, and profit is going to stockholders and such, they had revenue, expenses, and the money that was passed on to the government. And they tried to maximize the amount that was passed on to the government, which is very similar to maximizing profit. The problem is, just like the exploitation of labor under capitalism leads to suboptimal use of labor and not enough automation in particular. Yes, you've heard that right. Capitalism leads to less automation that would be economically optimal. If workers were actually paid the full value of their labor, there'd be more automation. That's why, like, raising minimum wages can actually increase incentive to automate. Very often, I mean, nobody hires someone that they're not making a profit to employ. So the minimum wage workers at the higher minimum wage, their employers are still making a profit off of them. The ones who they can no longer profit off, they lay off. And that's why you can actually see slightly decreased employment when you raise the minimum wage. But even as unemployment goes up, you see increased investment automation, because employers have to pay workers a higher percentage of the value they produce. So that's in a capitalist country. You can see the more of the value someone produces they capture themselves as wages, the more you invest in automation, actually the more optimally you account for value of productivity and automation. So the Soviet system of doing things, though, ended up maximizing money sent to government, so underinvested in automation, and to a degree, labor unions weren't as free to strike as they should have been. They actually had quite a few labor strikes actually did occur, especially in the later years of the Soviet Union. So the idea that people couldn't strike, demand better wages, that's a lie. But they were not as common, the strikes, as they should have been, because the union bosses, because there were still trade unions in the Soviet Union, could be intimidated, afraid, just as, in capitalist countries, they're afraid to strike because they might get fired or retaliated against or even killed. The Pinkerton detectives famously killed union bosses in the 1800s in the United States, actually. And strikers, they would brutalize, torture, beat strikers. They would sometimes abduct them on the street, torture them. Famously, in a couple instances, threw hand grenades, early hand grenades in the 1800s into crowds of strikers in a couple big strikes, which the media had a field day over, and that's part of what turned public opinion in favor of labor unions a little more than it had been. the bread and roses strike was one where there were a bunch of female mill workers who struck, and they were brutalized by the Pinkertons, and because of women, violence against women being viewed differently than violence against men, this really turned the media against the business moguls, and this is what part of what actually started to win sympathy in the United States for labor unions, whereas they've been treated as subversives and evil before, because the newspapers are very much, I mean, they're owned by big capitalists a lot of times, though less so than today. Billionaire ownership of the media is a lot more common now than it was in the 1800s, actually. Mid 1800s, you start to get to the Gilded Era, you do see the media getting bought up. Anyways, so the labor unions weren't free enough to strike in the Soviet Union, and wages weren't high enough. What the Soviet Union should have been doing, and this is more congruent with Marxist theory actually than what the Soviet Union did. So this is more socialist than what the Soviets did, because they were not a perfect example of socialism. No country ever has been. I mean, no country is a perfect example of any system, but I'm saying it's not incongruent with their philosophy and system. Would have been to pay workers all the value they produced, so nothing gets handed on directly to the government, and then the government taxes the workers. This leads to the managers of state-owned enterprises investing more in automation, which leads to fewer problems with a labor shortage throughout the country. And yes, workers have to deal with taxes, which, by the way, the Soviet Union abolished most forms of taxation instead of relying on income from the state-owned enterprises, which was a huge mistake. They should not have done that. It led to over-reliance on surplus value being taken from the workers and then passed back to them through government spending, which led to underinvestment in automation, lack of sufficient investment in productivity. It led to a lot of the same problems that capitalist economies had, and this started to really harm the GDP growth rate in the Soviet Union in the later years. So that was the first big problem. Wages and trade unions not being powerful enough. There were some in the Soviet Union called to do more to empower trade unions, and they should have been listened to. The Trotskyists and actually Bukharinists both called for this to different degrees, but they were both purged from the Communist Party because it was a one-party state in the Soviet Union. That's, again, Leninism, not Marxism. Leninism is Marxism, but it's not all, It's like saying, some men are tall, all soldiers are men. It does not follow that all soldiers are tall or something. I'm trying to think of a good analogy, and my brain's farting a little, but the right logical structure for this. But basically, all Leninists are Marxists, but not all Marxists are Leninists, is the key thing to keep in mind here. And Lenin had some problems with his theories that caused huge problems for the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, he was the only one who was ever to turn his ideas into reality with a successful socialist revolution, or at least the first by many decades. There were some others later, but they just ended up mostly mauling themselves after. I mean, I'm not counting all the revolutions the Soviet Union helped inspire later, because they just copied what the Soviets did instead of finding their own ideas and paths. But because the Soviet Union was by far the first country to have a socialist revolution, everyone else just copied them, and that meant they copied all the mistakes in their theory. Anyways, so the first problem was how wages were handled and taxation was handled. The second problem was that something that the United States did that horrendously harmed the Soviet economy and actually harmed the economy of a lot of capitalist countries too. It was just a underhanded, dirty, unfair, vile move that should have never been allowed, and the United States should have paid a much bigger price for this diplomatically, and it did. And that is Richard Nixon, yes, that freaking scumbag. I'm sure you all know Nixon was corrupt as hell and dirty and terrible human being. Anyways, Richard Nixon ending the Bretton Woods global banking system. That may not sound important, but it was hugely important because Bretton Woods was a system that was set up as World War II was ending by FDR, Stalin, and Churchill, the three main leaders of the Allied powers. I mean, Soviets weren't part of the Allies, but the three main powers that were going to be on the victorious side of World War II, and they already knew it at that point. It was like 1944, I think, or 45. So as the wars wind down, and they were looking at what would be the skeleton, the structure of the new global economic system. And basically, it was agreed to give the United States control of the global currency, but the United States had to operate within certain rules that they were not supposed to violate, such as the US dollar being tied through a kind of indirect mechanism to gold and its value, so that the US couldn't just engage in unlimited deficit spending anytime it felt like it without consequences to the US economy. If the US was free to do that, then it would effectively be levying a sort of tax on the rest of the world, where everyone else would be subsidizing US deficits. And that's exactly what happened. Nixon tore up the Bretton Woods system. With it, tore up all the rules and restrictions on what the US could do under this global banking system, and then proceeded to fund enormous deficits that were put into the Vietnam War, so they didn't help ordinary Americans at all. That effectively the rest of the world was paying a sort of tax to pay for the US bombing babies in Vietnam and Cambodia, which was a genocide. The experts on it all agree what the US did in Cambodia was a genocide. It was just kind of like in Korea, which the leading English language expert in the Korean War says was a genocide. The US was murdering tremendous numbers of civilians that were not valid targets of war, just to break the will of the opposing side to continue the fight. That is evil, that's vile, it's a war crime, and the US got away with it. And this was funded by the entire planet, basically, because Nixon tore up the Bretton Woods global banking system. Not only that, but it allowed the US to put unilateral sanctions in place. Before that, in order to create effective sanctions, the United States had to sit down with all the other major economies of the world and agree to sanction a country. And it was hard for the US to, say, restrict the access of the Soviet Union to global financial markets and trade. After Bretton Woods was torn up, the United States could freely do that, and it did, and used it to hurt the Soviets. Trade is important for any country, socialist or capitalist. And the massive deficit spending also created inflation that devalued the foreign currency reserves of countries that had large foreign currency reserves. One country that had enormous foreign currency reserves of the US dollar was the Soviet Union, because they had been exporting oil and various raw materials to the capitalist world and accumulating US dollars, which was provide them a cushion against the United States trying to economically manipulate them. So it was done as a protective measure. Another country that had a large foreign currency reserve that was capitalist was France. France had been running a trade surplus with the United States for a very long time, selling lots of luxury goods to the United States. This trade surpluses effectively mean that your people are having a lower standard of living in order to invest in the future prosperity of your country, because you're not importing goods that could raise the quality of life for your people. France was selling luxury goods to the United States instead of either consuming them domestically or importing enough luxury goods in the US to balance it. And this was giving France both autonomy economically, ability to resist US control, and indeed, France was on the verge of leaving NATO when the Bretton Woods system was canceled, and had actually drawn up plans to do so, and the foreign currency reserves of US dollars were key to doing this, because otherwise the US could sink the French economy. De Gaulle, of all people, who was a right-wing bastard, but de Gaulle did not resented US control of France after World War II, and the French increasingly become a U.S. puppet. And so he was actually one of the masterminds of building up this large foreign currency reserve with the hope of leaving NATO. Um, France had had 30 years of economic runaway growth after World War II, which came to a screeching end with the end of the Bretton Woods gold banking system. So it screwed over France, it screwed over the Soviets, it helped a few countries such as South Korea and Japan, which saw very, very little economic growth before the end of Bretton Woods and started on a phase of exponential growth after. There are reasons for that. It's complicated. I've been talking too long, but the point is the U.S. through controlling the levers of global economy in ways that no smaller economy that had not been privileged due to history of being the most powerful country in 1944, 45. Didn't matter who was most powerful in the 70s. Uh, just that past, the historical privilege, plus the U.S. still being by far the world's biggest economy in the 70s, was able to manipulate the global system to retain its dominance. And this goes into why the Soviet Union lost the Cold War, because the alliance of the US and its allies and vassals was so much more powerful than the Soviet one. There's no way the Soviets ever could have won. It could have been ideologically mirrored. The Soviets could have been the capitalist power, and the United States could have been socialist, and the US would have still won because nobody could have ever hoped to stop the US, or it would have been extremely difficult. And the Soviets tried, and they came surprisingly close, but it was probably a doomed effort. Um, they're very lucky that they actually came as close as they did, that they were the first into space, although the fact that the Soviet system was great investing in scientific research and actually produced a lot of research breakthroughs in certain fields and a heck of a lot overall relative to how poor of a country they were. They were growing faster than the US percentage wise, but that only means that eventually they would caught up to America. Most projections say somewhere between 2050 and 2080, the Soviet GDP per capita would have equaled that of the United States. So they would have been equally wealthy. Of course, they wouldn't have had the privilege of having been as rich as the US was prior decades. So the US would have still had a massive lead in things like military assets that would have taken decades more, maybe even an entire century to level out. So there was just no way the Soviets had to endure far too long against a vastly superior power to hope to win. Top dogs tend to stay top dogs. It doesn't have anything to do with what their ideology is. They like to justify and say it's because we have a superior system, but it's really because they were already powerful to begin with. And power begets power. Anyways, I hope you folks enjoyed this video. Take care of each other. Be kind to yourselves. May always find a guy and start lead you home. I really should get to my next videos. So, adieu.